Brian Jewell was 17, still in high school, and like a lot of teenagers in October, he wanted a little extra money. There was a haunted hayride that needed people, so he signed up. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was a job, even though the pay wasn't much. But it was steady, and he liked that it gave him something to do at night instead of hanging around. Now, this is important to know. Brian was quiet but dependable. He didn't drink, he didn't mess around, and he was like one of those serious kids. If you told him to be somewhere, he was there. Now, he had been given a relatively small role. He didn't have to act much or even speak a lot, as the guests would just pass by on the wagons. A fake gallows had been built to make it look like a hanging. So the idea of this was straightforward and simple. So the wagon would stop, he'd deliver a few lines, then pretend to be hanged while the group watched. It was supposed to look real without actually being dangerous, like a little fun, scary thing. But I'm sure you're wondering how this actually worked, and this is how the crew explained it. The rope wasn't meant to hold any weight, and his feet would always stay on the ground. Now, to make sure everything would go smoothly, the scene had been tested before the crowds arrived, and everything looked fine. So when the first wagons came through, Brian did everything right. The tractor pulled up, the guests laughed nervously, and he said his lines. People gasped when the noose tightened around his neck, exactly how the script intended. The rope creaked under tension and the beam above groaned just enough to sound real. The spotlight flickered across his pale face, and his head tilted slightly to one side. It was convincing, unsettling, and the wagon moved on exactly on cue. He reset for the next group, loosening the noose and rubbing his neck where the rough hemp had pressed against his skin. It went smoothly for a while, but as the night went on, things started to blur together. The same lines, the same reactions, and the same wagon lights crawling against the field. Around him, other actors shouted and jumped out of the dark. People screamed, then laughed, so he's been hearing this on repeat. He could hear the tractor engines rumbling, the faint smell of exhaust mixing with damp autumn air. Sweat gathered under his collar despite the cold, and the rope brushed against the same spot on his throat over and over until it left a faint red mark. Now, at some point, the driver of the wagon reached Brian's stop again. He slowed down and waited for the speech, but nothing happened. He waited another few seconds, thinking Brian was just throwing in some extra suspense. But the silence kept going. Now, that wasn't like him. He was always on cue for that whole night. He always said the exact same thing every time. So the driver shut off the tractor and climbed out, obviously confused. Now, from where he stood, Brian looked perfectly in character. So he was still, head slightly tilted, and feet on the ground, just like every time before. The light from the tractor hit his face, and for a moment it looked flawless, like the perfect performance. His eyes were half open, fixed on nothing. The guests were whispering, not sure if it was part of the show or not. The driver called out to him, but he didn't move. He got closer, then closer again, and finally realized it wasn't an act. He yelled for help, staff came running, and when they reached him, his skin had already turned pale, a bluish tint creeping along his lips. His body was limp, and when they lifted him, his head slumped forward, with the noose digging deeper into the flesh around his throat. They grabbed the rope and lifted it off, trying to get him loose. Someone ran for a phone, and the guests were rushed off the wagon and sent back to the parking area. Some were crying, and some just froze in shock. No one understood what had happened yet. When paramedics arrived, they took over, but it was already clear that it was really bad. There was no pulse. His neck bore a deep line where the rope had pressed, the fibers leaving sprawling imprints. His eyes were open just enough to make it worse. Not wide, but unfocused, as if he had frozen mid-expression. What everyone thought was a prop scene had somehow become real. The ride was immediately shut down. Police arrived, then investigators, and later the medical examiner. They checked the gallows and the rope. The noose was frayed where it had rubbed against the beam, strands torn just enough to catch and tighten without release. Everything that had seemed safe earlier in the night was re-examined. His feet had been touching the ground, just like the set required, but the rope had tightened enough to stop his breathing. Investigators later found that the rope's counterweight system had jammed. It was designed to keep the noose loose no matter how he moved, but when it snagged against the beam above, the tension locked tight around his throat. And because his feet were still on the ground, no one realized he was actually being strangled. It looked perfect, motionless just like the act was supposed to. People who had gone on the hayride earlier couldn't believe it. No one had noticed it until it was too late. The last wagon of the night had rolled past him without realizing the scene wasn't a scene anymore. By morning, the news had spread through the town. People who had gone on the hayride earlier couldn't believe it, Parents called each other, trying to make sense of it. The words freak accident started showing up everywhere because nobody had any other way to describe it. The owners of the attraction closed it down, and the gallows were taken apart and thrown out. No one wanted to see it again. His parents sat at home while waiting for details that just wouldn't help. The idea that their son had gone to work and never came back didn't make sense, and no explanation was ever going to make it feel fair. The investigation eventually confirmed it was an accident. There was no foul play, no prank gone wrong. After that, every haunted attraction in the area changed its rules. Anything involving ropes or neck restraints was banned outright. Nobody wanted to risk another situation like that. It's kinda crazy and sad how a simple Halloween job turned into something that was absolutely horrific. Haunted Hilltop sits just outside Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's a big open property with a dirt lot out front and a trail that runs through the woods in the back. Every October, they turned it into one of those Halloween attractions. So basically a hayride, a haunted house, people in costumes, loud music, fog machines, the whole setup. Locals go there every year. Friday night, October 11th, 2024, it was packed. Families were showing up in groups, teenagers hanging around in hoodies, with younger kids running between the food stalls. The hayride was the main thing though. It was a big green tractor that pulled a flatbed trailer stacked with hay bales. It took people down a path lined with fake tombstones and jump scare spots. The ride looped around and came back to the lot every 15 minutes or so. Now 12-year-old Samuel Jensen was there with some friends. They had gotten dropped off earlier that night by, I'm guessing, one of the kids' parents. Now they weren't on the hayride yet. They were just walking around the open area near the trail where the trailers come back around. Now keep this in mind. The ground there was rough. It had uneven dirt, some patches of grass, and a small hill that led up to the main path. You could actually see the headlights from the tractors cutting through the fog into the engines before the wagons even came into view. Now the group of kids had been hanging around there for a while, talking and laughing, running in the dark like kids usually do when there's no one telling them not to. A few adults nearby said they had seen them moving closer to the edge of the path each time a hayride came by. Now this wasn't the first group of kids to do that. Kids always tried to get close to the wagons to spook riders or just mess around, but they had no one to really watch and keep these kids from doing that. Keep that in mind as well. So it was sometime around 10:30 when another tractor came through. The driver was an older man who had worked there before, so he drove slow, maybe 5 miles per hour. I don't really know the exact speed, but it was just enough to keep the ride moving while people on board looked around waiting for the next scare. The trailer behind him was full of parents, kids, and with some teenagers, but everyone was sitting on the hay bales, and these hay bales were facing outward, so they could only see what was in front of them, or eye level, and even at that it was hard because all of the fog. But either way, when the wagon reached the area near the hill, the kids were standing close again. Witnesses later said Samuel ran forward as the trailer passed. Now no one's like 100% sure, but some said he tried to grab onto the wooden side rail of the wagon, although others thought he might have been trying to hop on for a second and then jump off. But either way, he slipped. Now remember what I said earlier about the ground. It was not flat, and there were loose rocks and mud from rain earlier that week. So the moment his foot went out from under him, he fell sideways under the trailer. His shoulder and head struck the metal frame first, the impact snapping his neck backward. Before he could move or even shout, one of the trailer's rear wheels rolled over him. The weight of the wagon and its passengers, which is several tons, crushed his torso against the ground. The tire passed across his chest and abdomen, breaking ribs and rupturing organs. The impact forced blood from his mouth and nose instantly. And what makes this even worse, the people on board didn't even realize what happened, because of the noise of the engine and the screams from the haunted setup drowned everything out. Now remember, the driver couldn't see him from the seat as the tractor's lights pointed straight ahead, and with the noise of the engine and the people on board screaming and laughing, he didn't hear anything, nor did anyone in the trailer. Like I said before, the riders faced outward on hay bales stacked along the sides of the flatbed trailer. Now the wooden rails on the trailer came up to about chest height when you were sitting, and the hay bales themselves added a barrier that blocked anything below the edge. so if someone fell alongside or under the wagon, you simply couldn't see it from where you were sitting. Not only that, the trailer's floor sat about 2.5 to 3 feet off the ground, and the wheels were set underneath that flatbed, so anyone lying next to or even under the wheel line would be completely hidden unless you were standing and looking down from the side, which riders weren't allowed to do while the wagon was moving. So the ride just kept going on like normal. It was only when the other kids started yelling for him to stop. It took a few seconds for anyone to realize they weren't joking. When the driver finally stopped the tractor, people on the trailer started to get off because they thought the ride was over, right? And that's when they saw Samuel on the ground near the side of the trailer. He was lying partially under the hay and motionless. His shirt was torn and his body twisted at an angle that didn't look right. One leg was pinned beneath the edge of the wagon and the dirt underneath him was dark and wet. Someone yelled for help and people ran over. A few tried CPR while another person called 911. When they pressed on his chest, there was little resistance because several ribs had been broken inward and blood filled his airway. His friends stood back crying and shouting his name, unsure what to do. The first call to dispatch came in at 10:45 p.m. Deputies from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office were sent to the haunted hilltop along with paramedics. They got there within minutes and started working on him right away. Medics inserted an airway tube and tried to restart his heart, but his injuries were just too catastrophic. His chest had literally collapsed from the crush, and the internal bleeding was massive. They worked for nearly 20 minutes before pronouncing him dead at the scene. The area was cleared out. Everyone who had been on the ride was moved back toward the parking lot, and the staff shut the whole event down. Deputies interviewed the driver, the workers, and the witnesses, and everyone's story was the same. The tractor and the trailer were checked and everything was working fine. There was nothing broken or unsafe about this ride. It wasn't a malfunction or a setup issue. It was just one of those things that happens in a second and can't be undone. The attraction stayed closed for the rest of the night. The owners shut off the lights, sent everyone home, and told staff to stay until investigators finished. The deputies were there for hours taking photos and measurements and writing their report. A few days later, a GoFundMe was started for Samuel's family, and people from all over the county donated. His teammates held a candle vigil on the football field, and his number was written on their helmets. When the sheriff's office finished the report, they ruled it an accident. There was no foul play, no negligence, and no one was charged. It was really just bad timing and one mistake that turns into something no one could take back. After that, people started talking about safety at hayrides and haunted attractions in Tennessee. Reporters fairly pointed out that the state doesn't have strict safety laws for temporary events like this. Rides like Haunted Hilltop's Hayride don't require state inspection because they're not classified as amusement parks, so everything's left up to the operators. And the weeks after, some attractions in the area added fences and ropes along their routes to keep people from standing too close. Haunted Hilltop stayed closed for the rest of the season, and the owners said they didn't even know if they'd ever reopen it. It was Halloween night 2013 in West Hollywood, California. The streets along Santa Monica Boulevard were flooded with people, literally thousands of them, and they were all dressed up in every costume imaginable. The West Hollywood Halloween Carnival was one of the biggest events in Los Angeles County, so it drew around 500,000 people every year, turning several blocks into a giant open-air party. There were flashing lights, music from outdoor stages, drinks everywhere, and crowds so dense that moving from one block to another could take damn near 15 minutes. But among that crew was a 51-year-old man named Gilbert Estrada. He'd been coming to this event for years, practically every Halloween. Friends later said he loved the atmosphere, the energy, the costumes, and the sense of community. That night, he arrived in a costume like everyone else. He was wearing a homemade outfit made of burlap, straw, and fabric stripes. So kind of like camouflage or the ghillie sniper look. Something out of like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, if you know what that is. It was rough and layered, like something a hunter might wear. The costume was eye-catching, but what no one realized was how dangerous the materials actually were. We'll get into this later. But as I said before, the carnival stretched for blocks, right? With police officers monitoring traffic and keeping the crowds in designated zones. So around 10 o'clock, the streetlights mixed with the colored floodlights from the main stage. Music was blaring, people were laughing, and some people were even smoking or lighting sparklers. small things that didn't seem like much in the moment. The temperature had dropped slightly, but it was still warm enough for people to be out late in thin costumes. Gilbert was somewhere near the intersection of Santa Monica Boulevard and San Vicente Boulevard, standing among hundreds of other people gathered by one of the event's side areas. Witnesses said he was talking with a few people and may have been smoking a cigarette or holding one of these lighters. No one saw exactly how it started, but in a matter of seconds, his costume caught on fire. At first, the people around him didn't realize what was happening because the crowd was thick, and most assumed it was some kind of prop or for some reason part of his outfit. But the burlap and straw fabric ignited almost instantly, and within moments, the flames spread across his torso and up his back. Those materials are dry and fibrous, which burn fast and hot. The costume basically acted like kindling. The first flash burned through the outer layer, then the flames tunneled underneath, trapping heat between his skin and the fabric. Someone shouted and then the panic started. People began backing away as the fire grew. A few tried to help, but in a dense crowd, it wasn't easy. A woman nearby threw a drink on him, trying to smother the flames. Others started ripping pieces of his costume off while shouting for water or fire extinguishers. But by then his arms and chest were fully engulfed. Witnesses saw skin beginning to blister and peel from the heat. The smell of the burning straw mixed with that of burned fabric and flesh. The heat was intense. People close by felt it on their faces. Gilbert screamed and stumbled, clawing at the costume, but it clung to him. The burlap fibers, once lit, fused with the melting synthetic lining, so his hands would have stuck to the material with the skin on his palms, tearing as he tried to pull it away. The fire reached his face and neck, blackening the side of his jaw and singeing his hair. It only took a few seconds for the fire to completely engulf him. Witnesses described him as being on fire like a torch. A nearby security guard ran with a jacket, trying to beat out the flames. Another person threw their own costume cape over him to try to smother the fire, but when the flames were finally knocked down, his upper body was charred, dark, and smoking. The remains of the costume had melted into his skin in places, and his breathing was shallow and raspy from inhaling hot air. Parts of his throat and airway had been seared. The music had stopped by then, with organizers noticing the commotion and radioing for help. The smell of burning fabric and smoke filled the air, and the crowd around the scene broke apart as firefighters and paramedics rushed in. Firefighters from the Los Angeles County Fire Department arrived quickly, given that the emergency crews were already stationed along the Chronicle route. They managed to extinguish the remaining flames and immediately began emergency treatment right there on the street. The burns covered nearly his entire upper body, so his arms, shoulders, chest, and face. And the exposed tissue beneath was gray-white, the hallmark of full-thickness burns. Paramedics covered him with sterile burn sheets, started IV fluids, and gave oxygen through a mask, but his pulse was fading. The ambulance took him to the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, less than 10 minutes away. Emergency staff were already prepping for his arrival because dispatch had called in a full burn victim. Paramedics worked to stabilize him during transport and giving oxygen and IV fluids while trying to manage the damage to his airway from inhaling superheated air and smoke. At the hospital, doctors assessed that he had suffered third-degree burns over roughly 80% of his body's surface. His airway was severely damaged and the skin on his torso was almost completely destroyed. Burn trauma of that extent leads to shock and rapid organ failure if not controlled. So they placed him on life support while working to rehydrate and regulate his body temperature. But despite hours of treatment, which were fluid resuscitation, ventilator support, and medications to stabilize his heart, the internal damage was just too severe. The heat had destroyed the muscle tissue and caused his organs to fail. By early the next morning, word had spread that the man who had caught on fire at the West Hollywood Halloween Carnival had not survived. The sheriff's department confirmed his identity as Gilbert Estrada of Los Angeles County. Investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the arson unit looked into how the fire started. There was no evidence of any foul play or any intentional act. Detectives concluded that the fire was accidental, most likely caused when Gilbert's costume came into contact with an open flame, possibly from a lighter or cigarette. The materials, burlap, straw, and synthetic fibers are extremely flammable. When exposed to even a small flame, they ignite fast and burn hotter than normal cotton or polyester. Officials used the incident to warn the public about costume safety. They explained that many people don't realize how dangerous certain fabrics can be when mixed with cigarettes, candles, or open flames at outdoor events. Synthetic fibers, untreated burlap, and straw can all ignite in under 2 seconds, and because these costumes often fit loosely, flames get trapped underneath, feeding on air and spreading rapidly.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.